My view is that this doesn't accord with the GDPR's consent definition. If all publishers go down this route, then there really will be no effective choice. I think there are more important considerations that we don't want to sacrifice on the altar of privacy.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs, and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, we have Robert Bateman here today. He's a data protection writer, trainer, and consultant. He's published millions of words on the topic, as well as led panel discussions and interviewed key well-known figures in the space on stage at privacy conferences. Besides freelancing as content creator on the subject, he's an associate with Act Now Training and the subject matter expert with Heward Mills, a data protection consultancy. With Robert, we will address the recent public outcry about Instagram and Facebook becoming paid services for whoever does not want to see ads or consent to the data processing involved in running them. Given that we have already got used to seeing cookie walls on European news websites, so in Germany, in France, in Italy, we want to open the wider debate around consent or pay business models, and from there, we will take it into whether digital advertising can ever really work under the current data protection framework beyond the usual lecturing on the wonders of contextual advertising offered by politicians or privacy experts with little understanding about how advertising really works. Let's get started. Rob, thanks for coming.
Thanks for the invite. Very flattering to be invited onto a podcast called Masters of Privacy.
That was the whole idea behind the title,
Yeah, I'm sure you don't lack guests with a title like that.
So, Rob, consent or pay? Do you have a definition for it? Because we've seen it evolving over the years. How would you frame it?
Well, I have been calling it the consent or pay model, but that could be a misnomer because, of course, it might be that consent is not consent if the option to refuse comes with a charge. So the idea is that you either agree, and I'll use agree because it's slightly less loaded than consent, to certain data processing activities that are not essential to receiving a service, or you pay a fee. So a clear example of consent or pay is in so-called cookie paywalls, which we see on some news websites. I actually encountered, I think, my first one in the wild yesterday on Der Spiegel, the German news website.
Yes.
And so when you arrive at their homepage or the page of the article you want to read, Der Spiegel asks if you will accept tracking cookies that will personalize advertising on that website and I believe others, or if you would like instead to pay a subscription fee. So the choice is between accepting the use of your personal data for certain purposes that do not, arguably don't benefit you, or you pay up.
Excellent. That's a great preamble. So, Okay, you have been writing a lot about data protection, and you know probably the guidelines inside out. Do you remember the EDPB guidelines on consent, or maybe how the ICO and other DPAs have adopted them in terms of the definition of valid consent, and how do you see, you know, do you think it respects this scenario that you just described? So, Spiegel, does it respect free consent?
Yeah. So cards on the table, my view is that this doesn't accord with the GDPR's consent definition. Now, when I say that, people draw all sorts of conclusions about my philosophies and accuse me of believing that Facebook should be some sort of charity, or publishers should go out of business. I really am not commenting on any of that when I say that I don't think the GDPR's definition of consent allows for this model. Now, that's not to say that it won't be allowed, but I think it is an imaginative interpretation of the law to accept consent or pay. Now, the EDPB guidelines you mentioned there, they analyze the GDPR's definition of consent and the conditions for consent in the GDPR, and also some stuff from the recitals, which are kind of non-binding preamble to the law, as you'll know. And they draw some kind of contradictory conclusions. They appear to be very much against the notion of consent or pay. They say, for example, that the user should not face any costs for refusing consent. But earlier in the document, they appear to say that the user should not face any significant costs. Now, those are two very different statements in this context, because the first suggests that no payment option can be offered as an alternative to, for example, tracking cookies. But the latter suggests that there could be a payment option, but it shouldn't be too expensive. So there's a lot going on here, and it mostly hinges on the GDPR's phrase freely given, which is part of the core definition of consent. Other very relevant uh, words on consent in the GDPR are that the user should be able to withdraw or refuse consent without detriment. That's in the recitals. And that it should be as easy to withdraw consent as it was to give consent. So the question then becomes, what does detriment mean? And I actually think the killing blow for this kind of model would be the withdrawing of consent, because if Facebook, for example, switches to this consent or pay model, and I wish to withdraw the consent I've given for them to track me as a Facebook user, I will have to go downstairs, find my credit card, type in the number. I'll have to work an extra, 10 minutes to pay the fee every month. And I would consider that to be harder than it was to give consent, which only involved clicking one button. So I actually think that's the key provision in the GDPR that excludes this model. But other people put more weight on the freely given element of consent, and also the without detriment mention in the recitals.
Very good. Well, thank you. If it helps, I agree with you. Uh, up to the GDPR, it is true that we had when e-privacy was sort of standing alone, and there was hope that we would have an alignment through either the privacy regulation or risk-based approach to even cookie consent. Back then, the ICO would talk about intrusiveness and levels of intrusiveness of cookies. For example, when we talk about cookies, to the point that because there was no Article 411 or no stricter sort of standard for consent, then we could still look at analytics cookies. And for instance, the ICO in its first guideline back in the day, they would say, well, those are not likely to pose a threat. So even though, you know, Article 5.3 of the Privacy Directive does say you do need consent because you're writing to the browser or reading from the browser. We do not think it's going to be, a big problem, so we'll be lenient. Over time, even these cookies with a higher threshold, of course, they also became an issue because it wasn't about levels of intrusiveness or even open to that kind of interpretation. But now we find the DPAs taking positions as of today, pressed by all of the stakeholders that need to make a living out of advertising. So as you said, one thing is looking at first whether the law, by as you were doing, looking at the GDPR, really contemplates the possibility of calling this free consent. And then another one is whether the principles that inspire the law would also make room for it, if that makes sense. So let me ask you something. Uh, Back to the core sort of principles. Back in the day, well, the late Giovanni Buttarelli made a very good point about a fundamental right not being commoditized and the risk that we could put a price on such a thing as data protection, which goes beyond whatever we can feel today as a threat and into possible consequences in a future that we cannot even predict.
I, in my very annoying centrist, middle of the road uh, way, have been thinking a lot about this because Schrems also made this point that the right to privacy should not be commoditized, and we should not have payment conditions on such an important fundamental right. But I wonder if we do already do this with other rights. And I tend to make up absurd examples. This is the philosophy graduate in me. And people wave them off because they sound so silly. But I think that it is a good way to follow through on some of these sort of principles. So, for example, everyone would accept that privacy is not an absolute right, and you need to give up some to access almost any online service because sometimes it's essential for the performance of the contract, blah blah blah. I think the same possibly could apply to speech, where there are some contexts in which you could imagine an event where you pay to speak, audience attends for free, their freedom of speech is curtailed, and the person who paid to be on the stage, their freedom of speech is not. And while I don't know if such an event exists, I don't know if it would be illegal on fundamental rights grounds. Now, of course, we have a slightly different conception of freedom of speech to those on the other side of the Atlantic, where it all depends on what the government's stopping you from doing. There's a slightly broader but also less liberal conception of free speech in Europe. And I think that you do give up your rights in certain contexts, and you do pay for greater freedoms, and even to avoid having your rights restricted in some contexts. Now, the point for me about the idea of consent or pay is that the drafting of the GDPR seems to have very clearly intended to avoid these sorts of situations. And if the CJAU has given some suggestion recently, as you'll know, in the Bundeskartellamt case. I've been writing that word all morning. where it suggested that there might be an option to provide a paid service as an alternative to providing consent. I really think that perhaps the drafting then of the GDPR was, you know, wrong if that was the intention to allow that kind of model. I have heard an argument recently that this idea of a detriment, you don't suffer a detriment by being denied access to a service to which you have no legal right. So it's fair enough to say that I don't have a legal right to have a Facebook account.
True.
And so, do I really suffer a detriment if I can't open one? Well, given, to give another one of my silly examples, let's imagine I live in a village, there's only one shop within 5 miles. The shop switches to a consent or pay model. I don't want to give my consent, so I can't go in the shop. I think it would be a stretch to say that I have not suffered a detriment in that case, even though I don't have a legal right to go to that shop. That is a detriment. I mean, there's a very clear, that's kind of what money's all about. It's about detriments and incentives. It represents a benefit or a detriment if you don't have it. So I think that people are interpreting the rules perhaps as they would like them to be. Um, I don't really have a stake, so I can just give my honest, objective interpretation of them.
This is a very good point. If detriment and the level of detriment is pondered, maybe there the free press has some sort of advantage. We could sort of take it to that extreme and think, okay, having no access to Instagram is not as much as an issue as it is having no access to a free press and sort of the fifth pillar of democracy. So that some of these DPAs maybe had a point in terms of giving special treatment to their local media. And then there's the opposite argument, which is that if instead of looking at a detriment, if we look at the level of risk and again the level of intrusiveness, the reality is that Facebook has a stronger case in the sense that, of course, it doesn't share data with 365 or whichever number of third parties are mentioned in a recent paper, right? So there's going to be less of a risk if you only deal with Meta than you do if you do in if you deal with the open market in the open RTB or real-time bidding ecosystem in the open media, where there's less control and more risk.
Mm. That's an interesting dimension to the problem, I suppose. And actually, I wonder if we try to narrow down what constitutes a detriment, that probably doesn't actually help news publications because not having access to a news, I think we have to imagine what would happen if every news publisher switched to this model. And I think that's probably what was intended when the commission proposed. I didn't follow the trilogues at the time, but with the pro the definition of consent is probably designed to avoid such a situation where people really, in practice, have no choice but to consent. If if we decide that this model is legal, then it would be legal for presumably every website to adopt it. And you also would have the situation of, well, how much is acceptable and who decides and how do they decide? Does it have to be based on you see in these American laws, the US state privacy laws try to introduce these provisions around what they call financial incentives, loyalty cards, for example. And they're very clumsily written provisions where the business has to estimate how much value it derives from users' information. And give that estimate in their notice of financial incentives, and it is ugly in terms of legal drafting. The GDPR doesn't do that, so that's why we're having this big debate about it. But I think that demonstrates how ethereal these concepts can be. You know, the value. I very much doubt that Facebook makes $14 a month or whatever it is, particularly from someone like me that never uses it, that does have a dormant account. So are they trying to dissuade people from doing it, or why would they if they can make more money that way?
uh, Many of us, many people warned that this could be, that this was sort of, this opened sort of the can of worms, which is the CNIL had already issued some guidelines explaining that it would not accept cookie walls. And of course, the press was already going in that direction. And the IAB then complained to the Conseil d'Etat in France, which eventually went back to the CNIL and said, no, you cannot do that. This is not within your competencies. So all of these people should have a right to negotiate however they see fit. It doesn't go that far. It's a very vague resolution. But in the end, bottom line is that then the CNIL couldn't stop this thing from spreading. And now, in the same manner as you were going into Spiegel or you go into Zeit and all of these German sites now in Germany, it's prevalent. You open Le Figaro and it's exactly the same. If you try to refuse, it's even trickier. If you refuse, then automatically you land on the on the paywall. So in Spain, the AAPD just updated the guidelines on cookie consent, and it finally opens up the possibility that it could be a compensation. So now that we have this scenario, then we've paved the ground for now Meta to do what you said. I'll charge 13 euros, $14 a month, and then you'll have an option to use it for free, which leads me to think and ask you, what if in reality there is no possible business model for advertising that is based on personal data? And I'm jumping, 1,000 steps ahead, but simply thinking, why is nobody complaining about Netflix? Netflix has like a cheaper version, I believe, if you tolerate ads, and then a more expensive version. I am sure they're collecting some data in terms of the, building the profiles and so on. And I can see that for now, they're not as targeted in terms of the potential for example, direct to consumer, smaller advertisers to, aim at a very niche audience. But nobody's complaining, at least not so far. And if the future is like this, then maybe Meta and also the publishers should simply give up in terms of trying to provide highly targeted advertising, since consent is never going to be valid. How do you see that?
Yeah. So there are so many. I'm going to have to pick one of the many thoughts to start with that I'm having about this. Firstly, I must say I don't, and we all know this in our privacy bubble. People don't generally care that much about cookies, and they would choose the free option. I myself have a very low risk profile, and I click away cookie banners occasionally. I mean, I use various plugins and private search engines and so on because it's easy to do so. Anything beyond easy, I just say, well, I'm never going to see any consequence of this. I think that we make a mistake when we think of privacy risks as on too individual a basis, because for 99% of people, there is no significant risk to cookies. I appreciate that might be a controversial thing to say, but the scenario in which it comes to bite them later on in life, I think, is unlikely. There are more nebulous and nefarious consequences, perhaps. I've never bought in too much to the harms around personalization and algorithmic feeds. I quite like my Twitter feed, for example, to show me stuff that it thinks I'll like. I think the harm arises on a societal level, and that this is why we do have this strong consent provision in the GDPR, because, like we speculated earlier, if all publishers go down this route, then there really will be no effective choice. And people who have a more serious risk profile than I do will be, will feel obliged to accept cookies or tracking when they don't really want to. And that is not freely given consent by definition. Now, I'm pretty emphatic on my reading of the law here, and I'm not normally, but I think do people look at the state of the publishing industry, and they also look at Facebook, who are, we might not be very sympathetic, but they are struggling, and particularly in the European market. So I am not judging them for, to be honest, considering this model. Um, and I certainly don't judge the publishing industry for hoping to go down this route. I would love to be able to say that personalized ads are completely useless, and it's much better to do contextual ads. And in my experience, the inferences made about me by Facebook and virtually anyone when I've checked have been completely useless. But I will take advertisers' word for it that targeting works to some extent. There, common sense tells me that there must be a reason that these companies are so desperate to cling on to this model. So I, whenever I'm having these debates, I try to imagine, for example, I don't want to go too off track, but when there was a risk that Facebook would have to pull out of Europe and Instagram due to the international data transfer issue. Now, that wasn't a bluff, in my opinion. If full compliance with those rules would have prevented them from offering Europeans a Facebook account. It just doesn't work without data transfers. And there was no real way for them to do it legally at that point. Now, people would have been totally baffled and probably quite furious if their access to those services had been cut off for something that we understand is important, but probably doesn't resonate as much with the general population. So I do worry about the alternative to the current online advertising model, as abhorrent as it is in many ways and as problematic as it is in its present state. I worry about people having to pay £3 a month here, £4 a month there, 10 a month here. I do worry about shutting people out of the internet. It's not really an issue for me as a relatively high earner, but it is a big issue for many people. I'm also quite frivolous, so I've got lots of little subscriptions going. So I do worry about it, and I really don't have an answer. All I know is that I it is not compatible with the GDPR's consent definition, and I've gone back and forth on this with many people. No one has persuaded me otherwise. I think it takes I think the most obvious reading of the law is that it's not allowed. And that's one of my clearer positions on data protection interpretation.
Very good. Yeah, I'm also constantly looking for a way to avoid privacy fundamentalism, if I can call it like that, and that sort of an extreme focus on being purists. Also, with a risk of following what sometimes derives into a political agenda, which is something that I really would hate, which is, using our DPAs in the EU to really simply serve whoever is closer to us. And of course, the press is pretty close to the political, you know, uh, powers. So that's always something that has a certain stink. And I'm always looking for a solution that doesn't differentiate on that basis, but rather on solid principles, on solid grounds. And so, as you said, I agree. Cookies are not as risky in terms of what could happen to you. As of today, it is not really about cookies anymore. Most of the scenarios now for consent, even though, of course, no one's ready for the cookieless world, but we are paving the ground for IDs. Many people are collecting, of course, first party data with the idea of using cross site, cross domain identifiers. And those are tied to properties and to data points that data brokers can then put in the market. And I also believe that targeted advertising has a reason to exist. That if you have a small company and you only sell classical electric bicycles, you don't have the budget to go on TV, and you don't have the budget to go after a very large audience. You need to be very selective. And even though I also think things don't work as well as they tell us, and that much of ad tech is also there simply because of inertia. But at the same time, there's got to be a way for the smaller player and the small retailer, for example, in direct to consumer, to find the niche audience. And what about now bringing something else on board, which is, or putting something else on the table, which is anonymous data? There was a very promising case, recent case, which is the Single Resolution Board case at the CJEU on anonymous data and on whether the receiving party not having the way to get back to the individual, that could be deemed non-personal data. Therefore, for even for us not even to look at the GDPR. So my sort of dream here. Let's see what you think. If we had no personal data, because we get to the point where we find a threshold that we accept as being out of the GDPR, in the sense that publishers are collecting cohort data, and at the same time, we agree that there is a way not to store data locally. So not even the privacy sandbox, topics API, nothing that writes to the system, so that there's no e-privacy and there's no compulsory consent under e-privacy. No cookies and no topics API and no local storage. So if there's no e-privacy and there's no GDPR, can there still be advertising that helps smaller companies find demand or generate demand? How do you see the pieces moving in that direction?
Well, there's lots of players trying to do this, and I know some, and they are well intentioned. They're not, obviously they're out to make money, but they are seeing a problem and they think they have a technical solution. Often it's beyond my understanding because it requires some greater depth of technical knowledge than I possess. Google obviously is trying to do something like this with its topics, formerly Flock, is it? And Brave has been doing something like this for a long time with its weird little sort of crypto exchange thing. Um, I know many people who find out about the crypto angle on Brave and are surprised, but from the start, their idea was block ads, and the blocking is quite indiscriminate. I don't know if it's only third-party cookie ads or personalized ads that they block, and essentially replace them with their own, anonymized ads and their crypto incentive scheme. So I like thought experiments, so I won't quibble as to whether it's possible to set up a GDPR compliant and e-privacy compliant targeted advertising system. I suppose the question is whether there would still be harms, risks, and whether it would be, acceptable. It's very hard to it's very hard to identify what the problem with that would be. And I think that suggests that perhaps there wouldn't be one. Am I trying to find a problem so that I can continue to deride the ad tech industry? I don't know if there is a problem at that level of abstraction. If we imagine that it is an anonymous system, I suppose that does take a slightly broader definition of anonymity than because if the I know the general court case you referenced there with the data, the receiver of the data, if they can't identify an individual via the data, then it's not personal data, even when you send it to them. I believe that was the point there. Now, that is a valid, I think, interpretation of data protection law, but it's one of several that I would consider any of them to be, well, several of them to be acceptable. The UK is about to codify that definition of personal data, and it does the walls start closing in on those who would ban personalized advertising altogether, because it's very hard to see what the problem is with something like that, where the individual risk can be mitigated to the point of insignificance. Is there a societal risk to being advertised classic electric bikes? If you like classic electric bikes, I expect there are many scholars who would say yes. I think that is a bit of a stretch, to be honest. I'm not sure it's harmful in itself. So perhaps there is a technical solution that will allow personalization to continue. It still bothers me that the idea of not having choice. Um, you know, with Brave, for example, that is opt in. So I don't have any issue because I don't opt into it, but then they're not making any money out of me. So we're back to square one. Uh,
And you're using the
yeah,
browser and sort of, and I am too. And we're enjoying it on the back of whoever is participating.
yes, it's very good, but I don't want those ads popping up, so I turn them off. But they're doing it right. I know the DPO with Brave, and they get fully GDPR compliant consent, as far as I can see, for something that would require it under the privacy directive. I don't know if everyone started doing that, they would have a lot of freeloaders like me.
That's the thing. Exactly. What's the sample size if they ask well? And that's sort of that's the issue here. And that's why we have consent or pay and consent walls, because nobody was really respecting the definition of valid consent in the media. So I mean, not even, of course, the large platforms. And it was only recent. I mean, I remember that there was a time when in France, TikTok, Google, Microsoft received all these like 50 million euro fines for not having a reject all option on first layer. And while that was happening, you would still have most people in Spain having reject all pushed to a second layer, so that convenience would be, of course, on the side of accepting. And then sample sizes and audience sizes were more than useful for advertising. But now, with the new guidelines and with everybody saying you need a reject all at the same level as the accept all, then people start seeing that sample sizes, acceptance rates, of course, are going to be 30%. In some studies, 11%. Some people say it's 50%. But is that enough to feed, the targeting system? Is that enough? If it's not enough, so if we accept that we need to ask properly, and asking properly results in not good targeting, and that's probably why Meta is going that direction. If I ask well, then I worry about the volumes and how useful that is. So then I do not ask. So in the absence of consent, we have legitimate interest. And also Bundeskartellamt has, in that case, it's been very clear, just in case it wasn't clear enough, that legitimate interest is not valid for advertising. And then there's anonymous targeting, which I was referring to earlier. And then the last option would be, let's destroy, of course, let's just accept that advertising is evil if it is based on personal data. and therefore let's only see ads from Gillette, P&G, and let's all buy from large CPG companies and kill the opportunity for smaller businesses, which is also pretty dystopian.
Well, I suppose there's two areas I might push back on. The I wonder if anonymous targeting might be an oxymoron. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Yeah,
Um, it depends really on your definition of personal data, of course, as we discussed. Whether any sort of identification process, even if you're not linking to a kind of offline personality, um, I think that the walls between the online and the offline are increasingly meaningless. So identifying someone on the internet, associating any 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 one data set with another is some act of identification. So I don't know if that will ever be truly possible. But yes, I mean the parameters of your question were that we develop a technology that we all agree is anonymous. So um, the other point is regarding the effectiveness of personalized advertising. Now, I suppose you do hear a lot of privacy activists saying, "Just do contextual advertising. It's fine." There are some studies that suggest it's equally effective. A few that suggest it's more effective. Some that suggest it's not as effective. I mean, we might just see what happens, I guess, if everyone actually starts complying with the law. We also have the matter of the privacy regulation, which, you know, we're still waiting for. And there might be some scope for uh, more non-consensual processing within that. I don't think it would be marketing related though. Maybe analytics or
yeah,
something.
exactly.
Even the UK in its GDPR reforms has not removed consent for marketing cookies um, because that was seen to be a step too far. It's all a bit of a mess, really. I do I do support, to be honest, quality journalism. I know that's become associated with elitism, but the recent output I've been seeing on Twitter has reminded me of journalistic standards do exist, and we do need a press industry of some sort to support that. There are many publications that I do not read and do not advocate for, but their journalists do stick to certain standards, and they require money. We can't just have citizen journalists. That would be, I think, the balance. If that were the outcome of banning consent or pay models, I would say let's change the law, to be honest. If it really did mean the collapse of quality news publications, then I would say we should allow consent or pay, because there are balancing of rights, right to information, right to privacy, people having some sort of choice still, even if they have to pay. I think there are more important considerations that we don't want to sacrifice on the altar of privacy. But as I keep saying, we would need to change the law, I think, because that is not really what the law says.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Sergio. It's been great. Really good to talk to you. We're thinking along similar lines here, so it's good to have a chat about it.
Many thanks. Many thanks. Okay, that's all for today. And you will find some episode notes and links to our social channels on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.